October 1988. Inside the oak room of the Plaza Hotel, a space once reserved for the most powerful men in America. Workers in protective coveralls move through walls that have not changed in nearly a century. A crowbar strikes antique brass. The sound is sharp, unforgiving. Custom-made fixtures, shipped from Europe generations earlier, fall to the floor like scrap. There is no fire, no rubble, no bodies, and yet something is disappearing. This is not a renovation. It is not decay. It is a surgical extraction, performed in broad daylight, under electric light, legalized by contracts and balance sheets. At this moment, the Plaza is still the most famous hotel in America. Its name fills films, politics, and popular culture. Its reputation is at its peak. The revolving doors still turn. The chandeliers still glow. But inside, a soul is dying. No one dies biologically. What vanishes is a community that once lived here. The institutional memory of generations of staff. The identity that made the Plaza more than a luxury address, that made it an institution. And the real question is not what was removed. The question is, who had the right to do this, and why it was allowed to happen at all? To understand how a national symbol could be hollowed out legally, we have to go far back, before the fame, before the mythology, to a time when the Plaza was just an ordinary building, standing at the corner of Fifth Avenue, waiting to become something America would later believe was eternal. If you want to understand why the most powerful places often die in the quietest ways, stay with us. And if you are interested in the hidden histories behind America's greatest symbols, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because this is not just the story of a hotel, it is the story of how power operates when no one is left to protect its soul. In 1890, at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 59th Street, the Plaza Hotel opened its doors for the first time. This was not the building we recognize today. The original Plaza was an 8-story brick hotel, designed in a style typical of the late 19th century. Solid, respectable, but not imposing, and not ambitious. At the time, the Plaza was considered a good hotel. It attracted steady guests. It generated reliable profits. It served a growing middle and upper middle class in New York. But the original Plaza was not a symbol. It did not set cultural standards, and it did not force the nation to look at it as a statement. This distinction matters, because failure was not what doomed the first Plaza. It did not collapse. It did not go bankrupt. It did not fall into visible disrepair. It simply became insufficient. While the building remained largely unchanged, the world around it transformed at extraordinary speed. Central Park, once a controversial urban experiment, began to mature. Trees grew tall. The park became the spiritual and visual center of Manhattan. At the same time, Fifth Avenue was evolving into a new axis of American power. Private mansions rose along its length. Industrial fortunes relocated their addresses. Land values climbed year after year. Within little more than a decade, the area surrounding the Plaza was no longer merely desirable. It had become symbolic, and the original Plaza fell out of step. Not because it was ugly, not because it lacked modern technology, but because it failed to project what the new ruling class demanded. They were no longer looking for comfort. They were looking for declaration, a place where simply walking through the doors would announce to the world, I have arrived. The original Plaza could not do that. Yet there was one detail few noticed at the time. Despite its popularity, despite its prime location, the Plaza remained, in legal terms, a private asset. It carried no landmark status, no historic protections, no legal barriers preventing its demolition. This is the first true contradiction of the story. The Plaza was treated as shared memory, but on paper, it was only a structure that could be erased and replaced. The question was, who would be ambitious enough to do it, and why they believed destroying the old Plaza was not an ending, but the beginning of something far greater. The answer comes next. By 1905, as the original Plaza began to fall out of step with the world forming around it, a new figure entered the story, carrying ambitions far larger than the hotel business itself. His name was Harry Black. Harry Black was not a hotelier. He did not come from the service industry. He was a dealmaker, a financier of construction, a man who believed power did not reside in experience, but in control of land. Born in 1863 inches, Canada, Black came to the United States as a young man and rose quickly within the construction world. By the early 20th century, he had become the head of the George A. Fuller Company, one of the largest construction firms in America, responsible for many of New York's earliest high-rise structures. But Black was not satisfied with building for others. He understood that real profit did not come from bricks and steel, but from ownership of position. The corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park South was no longer just real estate. It had become the new stage of American wealth and power. And the original Plaza, though still profitable, no longer matched that ambition. Black's decision was not renovation. It was not modernization. He chose to demolish the old Plaza entirely, not to correct a failure, but to replace it with something that had never existed before. In 1905, the project for the new Plaza officially began, backed by a budget of $12.5 million, an extraordinary sum for its time. Adjusted for inflation, this investment would exceed $400 million today. This money was not spent to build a comfortable hotel. It was spent to create a declaration. To execute that vision, Black selected Henry Janeway Hardenberg, the architect behind the Dakota Apartments and the original Waldorf Astoria, buildings that had already shaped the visual language of elite New York. Hardenberg did not design the Plaza as a functional structure. He designed it as a symbol. The French Renaissance chateau style was chosen deliberately. It referenced European aristocracy without copying it. This was American wealth, creating its own image of authority. The building rose 19 stories, clad in limestone, crowned with a green copper roof, standing directly opposite Central Park. From its facade alone, the message was unmistakable. This was not a place to pass through. This was a place to be recognized. When the new Plaza opened in 1907, the numbers spoke for themselves. 800 guest rooms, 500 private bathrooms, at a time when many hotels still relied on shared facilities. Telephones in every room, central heating, a pneumatic tube system carrying messages between floors. These were not conveniences. They were statements. Inside, every detail reinforced the same message: imported marble, crystal chandeliers, rare woods sourced from forests that no longer exist. Each space was designed to convey order, stability, and permanence. The plaza did not announce its luxury. It compelled visitors to feel it. At this moment, the plaza crossed a crucial threshold. It became more than a hotel. It became an institution. Yet, one question remained unanswered. How long can a building designed to represent permanence survive in a society where ownership can change with a single signature? The answer lies with the people who entered the plaza after 1907, and with how this place became a living community before the first cracks began to appear. After opening in 1907, the plaza quickly became something that went beyond the definition of a hotel. It became a stage on which American power performed for itself. Politicians chose the plaza because they knew their rivals would be there. Financiers used it as neutral ground, a place to negotiate numbers capable of shaking entire markets. Popular culture gravitated toward the plaza because fame amplified itself within its walls. Cinema chose the plaza because a single frame was enough to signal power. But what truly set the plaza apart was not the people who passed through. Its real value was created by those who stayed. From the early years of the 20th century, the plaza developed a population of permanent residents. They did not treat it as temporary lodging. They lived there. They were wealthy widows who had inherited vast fortunes but did not wish to live alone in empty mansions. They were retired industrialists who preferred reliable service to maintaining private households. And they were families who remained across generations, children growing up in the same corridors that once welcomed heads of state. Over time, the plaza became a village contained within a single building. Residents knew one another. They recognized each other's voices in the elevators. They encountered the same faces every morning and every afternoon, moving through familiar routines. The staff knew every family. Names did not need to be asked. Preferences did not need to be written down. Doormen recognized residents not by their faces, but by the way they walked from a distance. A change in pace was enough to know who was approaching. This was not a skill taught in training manuals. It was memory accumulated over years. At the plaza, employees did more than work. They inherited the profession. Some families served the hotel across 2 or 3 generations. Knowledge was passed verbally. Standards were understood rather than documented. How to seat a guest. How to greet them. How to remain silent when silence was required. The interior spaces of the plaza reinforced this order. In the afternoon, residents and guests gathered in the palm court, where light, passing through the stained glass ceiling, transformed afternoon tea into a social ritual. Information was exchanged here long before it appeared in newspapers. On the ground floor, the Oak Room functioned as a male domain for decades. Long lunches, decisions never recorded in minutes. On grand evenings, the grand ballroom opened for galas, where status was confirmed not through conversation, but by position within the room. These rituals repeated themselves over decades. They created the impression that the plaza was immutable. That is why, when the children's book featuring Eloise appeared in the mid-20th century, many assumed it was fiction. For those who had lived at the plaza, it was not. Eloise was not a fairy tale. She was an exaggeration of real life. Children truly ran through those corridors. They truly called staff members by name. They truly grew up in a world where service and familiarity were inseparable. The plaza functioned this way for one simple reason: continuity. The same people, the same rituals, the same rhythm of life. But this stability concealed a quiet contradiction. A community could endure within a building that remained, legally, a transferable asset. A way of life could depend on familiarity, while ownership could change with a single financial agreement. The question is, what happens when those who buy the plaza no longer see it as a place to live together, but as a system to be optimized? The answer begins to emerge when the plaza changes hands for the first time and the earliest cracks begin to show. After the Second World War, the plaza entered a new era, not because it collapsed, but because the way it was understood began to change. In 1943, in the middle of wartime America, the plaza was sold to Conrad Hilton. Hilton did not buy the plaza because he loved its rituals. He bought it because he saw a symbolic asset that could be absorbed into a system. Hilton came from a very different world. He was a hotel entrepreneur shaped by the logic of chains, a man who built his empire by acquiring hotels under pressure and integrating them into a unified operational structure. His philosophy was explicit. A good hotel should operate like every other hotel in the system. Processes must be measurable. Costs must be controllable. Efficiency must be optimized. Once the plaza entered that logic, a quiet transformation began. Rituals that did not appear in operational manuals slowly disappeared. Positions that existed because of tradition were labeled redundant. Departments that had once functioned independently were merged to reduce expense. There was no single decision dramatic enough to cause shock. Only small adjustments, repeated again and again. Fewer staff members for the same workload. Less time for each guest. Less space for personal relationships. Efficiency increased, but identity began to fade. The first people to notice were not short-term visitors. They were the permanent residents. They noticed when familiar staff members vanished without explanation, when details, once remembered by human memory, now had to be checked in files, when service remained correct but no longer felt precise. The plaza continued to operate, but the feeling of a community began to loosen. Hilton did not own the plaza long enough to destroy it. In 1953, he sold the property. Yet Hilton left behind something more consequential than financial results. He changed how the plaza was perceived, from a social institution into an asset that could be standardized. Over the next 2 decades, the plaza changed owners multiple times. None of them destroyed the building. None of them rebuilt what had been lost. The hotel was operated as a high-end real estate asset designed to generate steady cash flow. There was no long-term investment to restore its culture, no incentive to rebuild the residential community that had once existed inside. The plaza kept running, but it ran like a body growing old. Then the outside world shifted. In the 1,970 seconds, the New York City entered a severe fiscal crisis. The city stood on the edge of bankruptcy in 1975. Crime increased. Large areas became less secure. Wealth left the city. Young families no longer wanted to live long-term in Manhattan. Tourism declined. Hotel revenues came under pressure. The plaza aged alongside the city. Maintenance costs did not decline with revenue. A building constructed at the start of the 20th century required constant repair. Electrical systems, plumbing, structure, limestone, everything demanded money. The plaza did not collapse overnight, but pressure accumulated steadily. In this context, society began to worry Not that the plaza would be demolished, but that it could be hollowed out without anyone stopping it. The law began to enter the picture. In fact, the first signal had appeared earlier. In 1969, New York City designated the plaza's exterior as a protected landmark. This was not a celebration. It was a defensive reaction. Society wanted to preserve the image of a national symbol, even as control over how it was lived inside continued to slip away. Around the same period, another plaza tradition collapsed in public view. For more than 60 years, the Oak Room had been reserved exclusively for men, not because of written law, but because of social order. The women's rights movement challenged that order. Protests followed. Lawsuits were filed. Public pressure mounted. Eventually, the Oak Room was forced to open its doors to women. This did not destroy the plaza, but it revealed something essential. Traditions that appear permanent exist only as long as social power allows them to. If the Oak Room could change, then nothing inside the plaza was absolute. After the shock of the 1,970 seconds, legal protection expanded. In 1986, the plaza was designated a National Historic Landmark. Key interior spaces, such as the Palm Court, the Oak Room, and the Grand Ballroom, were protected. The law preserved the stained glass. It preserved the oak paneling. It preserved the physical form. But the law could not preserve people. It could not prevent the dismissal of long-serving staff. It could not protect occupational memory passed across generations. It could not stop service reductions. It could not prohibit changes in business model. It could not prevent hotel rooms from becoming investment assets. By the late 1,980 seconds, the plaza entered its most dangerous state, protected from demolition, but not protected from operational exhaustion. The owners at that time no longer had the incentive or the resources to maintain the plaza as a living institution. Revenue no longer justified the cost. Legal restrictions made deep restructuring difficult. The plaza became an asset with enormous symbolic value and growing financial burden. In this context, selling the plaza was no longer a strategic choice. It became an exit. And in 1988, the plaza changed hands. The buyer was Donald Trump. Trump did not step into a healthy plaza. He stepped into one weakened by 4 decades of erosion, a symbol with a preserved body, but a diminished capacity to defend itself. And at that moment, when the prey was exhausted, the predator arrived. In 1988, the plaza changed hands under unusual conditions. It had not collapsed. It was not bankrupt, but it had lost the ability to defend itself as a living institution. The buyer was Donald Trump. The deal was announced as a symbolic victory. The purchase price was $407.5 million, the highest ever paid for a single hotel at the time. Adjusted to present value, the figure approaches $1 billion. But the fate of the plaza was not decided by the price. It was decided by how the deal was financed. Nearly the entire purchase was funded by debt, high-interest bonds, extreme financial leverage. From the moment the contract was signed, the plaza was no longer a hotel acquired for long-term operation. It became a financial instrument required to generate continuous cash flow simply to service interest. Debt pressure was not an external factor. It became the center of every decision. Anything that did not directly generate revenue was treated as a liability. Anything that could not be measured in cost and return was removed. Staff reductions began almost immediately. Large numbers of employees with decades of service were dismissed, not because they were ineffective, but because they were incompatible with a debt-driven operating model. With them disappeared institutional memory, details once sustained by lived experience, rituals never written into manuals, relationships built across generations. The service culture did not erode slowly. It collapsed quickly. The Plaza continued to deliver service that was technically correct, but it no longer delivered precision. It no longer carried the depth of a place that had once been lived in, not merely used. When cost-cutting proved insufficient to service the debt, Trump moved to the next strategy: condominium conversion. The hotel floors were converted into luxury residences. Sections of the plaza were separated and sold individually. Some units were offered for tens of millions of dollars each. Financially, this produced immediate cash. Socially, it produced irreversible change. The plaza was no longer a place where residents lived together for years. It became a building of absentee owners. Apartments locked for most of the year. People buying addresses, not community. Long-term residents understood exactly what was happening. They resisted. They filed lawsuits. They documented every violation, every service reduction, every adverse change. The conflict did not explode into a single public scandal. It stretched into a prolonged war of attrition. Quiet, exhausting, without winners. Meanwhile, the numbers continued to deteriorate. Revenue failed to keep pace with debt obligations. Operating costs could not be cut further without crippling the property. The plaza became an asset carrying an increasingly unsustainable financial burden. By 1992, the inevitable occurred. The plaza could no longer service its debt. Trump did not sell the plaza. He lost it. Creditors stepped in. Control was stripped away. Lenders absorbed losses measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Trump retained his name and a residual association, but operational control ended. The 4 years of Trump's ownership left clear consequences. An institution more than 80 years old had its operational structure broken. A community was hollowed out. A national symbol was converted into a cash extraction device. The plaza remained standing after 1992, but the plaza as a living institution was dead. And the next question was no longer what Trump did to the plaza. It was, what happens when a national symbol, after surviving this shock, is thrown into the global marketplace, where heritage is no longer tied to stewardship, but circulates according to international capital flows. After 1992, the plaza did not disappear. It did not collapse. It entered a different state. The soul of an institution had died, but the body was still far too beautiful to be abandoned. Control of the plaza passed to its creditors. From this point forward, the hotel was no longer viewed as a place to be stewarded over time. It became an asset to be restructured and transferred. The ownership carousel began to spin faster. The plaza moved through the hands of investors and corporations from multiple global power centers. Capital from Singapore entered first. The plaza was treated as a global symbolic asset, suitable for an international portfolio of high-end real estate. Then came developers from Israel. They viewed the plaza not as a hotel, but as a structure that could be further segmented, layered, and sold piece by piece. Next came capital from India. The plaza became embedded in a transnational investment network where the fate of the building was tied to legal and financial developments occurring half a world away. Finally, ownership passed to Qatar, a state-backed investment fund with vast resources, viewing the plaza as a marker of global prestige, a reputational anchor within an international portfolio. Each new owner arrived with promises of preservation, and most fulfilled those promises, at least in part. The facade remained intact. The palm court survived. The oak room was preserved in form. The grand ballroom remained magnificent, but the human structure did not return. The number of hotel rooms declined sharply over time. From approximately 800 rooms at its height, the plaza was reduced to only a few hundred operating as a hotel. The rest became luxury residences. The plaza gradually became a place to park capital, a safe address for global wealth, an asset capable of holding value through instability, a symbol beautiful enough to store money in without the need to live there. In 2005, preservation law expanded again. Key ground floor interior spaces of the plaza were placed under stricter protection. The stained glass ceilings could not be removed. The oak paneling could not be stripped away. Architectural details could not disappear. The body was preserved. As a result, the plaza today remains extremely luxurious, extremely beautiful, visually immaculate, but institutionally hollow. There is no longer a resident community living across generations, no longer occupational memory passed from one worker to the next, no longer the feeling of a village inside a building. The plaza is no longer a place people belong to. It is a place capital inhabits. And that is the final paradox of this story. A symbol preserved to perfection, yet existing only as a gleaming shell for invisible flows of money. The remaining question is not whether the plaza is beautiful, it is whether a place that has lost its soul can still be called heritage simply because its body survives. The story returns to where it began. The building is still there. At the corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park South, the chandeliers are still lit. The limestone is still white. The windows still reflect the city at night. Seen from the outside, the plaza never disappeared. But look closer, and what remains is only the form. Architecture was saved. The law preserved facades, glass ceilings, rare wood, the details money can measure. Culture was not. The people who once made the plaza a community left long ago. The rituals that could never be written into contracts vanished with the last people who remembered how to perform them. The plaza did not die from time. It died from being treated as a commodity. The more famous it became, the more it was extracted, the more it was admired, the more it was divided. And here, an unavoidable question emerges. Who truly owns a symbol? The name on the deed, or the people who lived in it, worked in it, grew old inside it, and eventually left? A building can survive for centuries. An institution cannot. Institutions exist only as long as people sustain them, through memory, ritual, and continuity that cannot be purchased. The plaza today is not just the story of a hotel, it is the story of an era, where power is measured by the ability to buy, and heritage is preserved by freezing appearance. This story is not finished, because the plaza is not unique. A number, on your screen now, are other stories, of mansions and landmarks. that once stood at the center of power, wealth, and ambition, and how they changed as the world changed. If you want to go deeper into those stories, into what happens behind elegant walls, and the true cost of wealth that stretches across generations, the next videos are waiting. If this story made you think, leave a comment. If you want to keep exploring legacies like this, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the end. See you in the next story.